He owes me the last few lectures. He doesn't come no more. Are you in charge of this now or what? Oh. Good evening, my friends. Let's dedicate our lecture to Lev Ben Reuven for his speedy recovery. רפואה שלמה, יהי רצון, השם ישלח לו רפואה שלמה, דרמה חברה ושסה גידתה.
And please for my father.
Also, עבור? או לעילוי נשמת נתנאל בן יעל טוב. ברוך השם תניחנו בגן עדן העליון.
And also for my father, לעילוי נשמת ברוכי בן שרה.
And לעילוי נשמת ברוכי בן שרה. ובכור בן שרה. ולעילוי נשמת חנה בת מרים. Okay. If you remember, we decided to undertake the study of Pirkei Avot from the historical point of view and also our philosophy, how we look upon the book of Pirkei Avot, the book of the fathers, which is a book of tremendous philosophies for the Jewish people as far as moralities and morals. And there is so much to learn in every passage that it is definitely a worthwhile type of learning. But some history background is required. We already discussed last week the transition of the Torah from the time it was given to Moses, to Moshe, who absorbed the Torah as a student of God himself. Therefore, he became a recipient of all the Torah, whatever Torah that can be studied throughout all the centuries, forever and ever, has been absorbed by Moshe, because obviously, when you are the student of God himself, so obviously what you will be learning a total learning that has absolutely no limitation whatsoever. Since God is perfect, so whatever He gives is also perfect. So there is nothing that you could say that is new that Moshe didn't know. As our sages said in the Gemara, כל מה שתלמיד ותיק עתיד לחדש קיבלו משה בסיני. Whatever you can ever innovate has been already given to Moses at Sinai. Then it was his duty to begin the transition of the Torah by giving it first to his students. The next generation after Moshe was his own students. Rather than his own children, he favored his own servant, who served him, of course, Torah-wise and everything. And his name was Yehoshua, the next leader of the Jewish people. The only difference is, it's a tremendous difference between Moshe and Yehoshua. Since Moshe received it from God himself, so we cannot compare the knowledge of Moshe to the knowledge of Yehoshua, even though Yehoshua was the direct student, disciple of Moshe. So now the transition of the Torah is given from hand to hand, from generation to generation. So Moshe first, and then Yehoshua, and then from Yehoshua it was given to the Nevi'im, to the Zekenim rather, the Shoftim, the judges that came after Joshua, and then after the era of the Shoftim, of the judges, began the era of the prophets, and then finally when the temple, the first temple of Israel, was destroyed in the year 586 before the common era by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. For the first time, the Jewish people endured a situation to which they were not prepared. So here I want your attention. The Jewish people now is dismayed. The temple of God was the temple of Israel, the source of tremendous encouragement for every Jew in the land of Israel. Jewish people didn't know the meaning of being in any place outside the land of Israel. They were not mixed with the Goyim. They were not acquainted with their culture nor their civilizations. They were Jews for Jews in Israel, each one doing his job under the umbrella of God and watching, in the time of King David, their beloved king, learning Torah every night and inspired by his presence. And then later on, by the sole fact, after the temple was built by the son of David, Solomon, it was a wonderful picture that was in the mind of every Jew, and every Jew looked up to that mountain upon which the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, was built. And it was a source of tremendous inspiration for every Jew. Every Jew thought about God every minute, and they served God the perfect way, having Beit HaMikdash, the temple of God, as a place that everybody knew that God has relocated, so to speak, and took residence in the temple of David, temple of Solomon. For at least 400 years, there was a marvelous situation in which Jews were totally separated from the rest of the world, not as far as business is concerned, because all the nations came in the time of Solomon and did business with him, but from being rather separated from the influence of the world. They were proud. Jews did not have a complex that Jews have for the last 2,000 years of inferiority, rather a Jewish complex. They did not have any limitations. Their pride was perfect pride in Judaism. Being Jewish was a real honor at that time. Even the world looked up upon the Jewish nation as a nation of God, until Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed the temple. Now, God absolutely allowed this to happen for a reason. Our sages say in the Talmud, because the Jewish people sinned, and once they sinned, God spent his anger on his house. That's how he punished the Jewish people. And the Jewish people were taken in captivity by the Babylonians, and for the first time Jews were separated from the land of Israel. Even though there was still a remnant in Judea, in the land of Israel, but now for the first time the Jewish agglomeration, the Jewish populations at large, were in Babylon. Now, even though Nebuchadnezzar has given the proper honor to Jews because he appreciated their wisdom, so therefore when he took them in captivity, he appointed them to be of high positions for the purpose to govern his cities and Babylon. He appreciated the Jewish wisdom. But at the same time, the Jews, even though they lived in Babylon in great prosperity, beautiful houses and everything, but they did not allow themselves to forget the temple of God and Jerusalem. They longed for the day to go back again. And that's why King David writes the Psalms, Al Naharot Bavel, Sham Yashavnu Gam Bachinu, Vezochrenu et Zion. On the rivers of Babylon, when the Jewish people came and they camped at the river, at the edge of the river, to cry for Zion, for the destruction of the temple. It's not like today, when it's very hard to find a Jew who longs so much for Israel. I mean, you long for it, but do you go? I mean, we are free to go. So how come not every Jew goes? It's because we don't have the same, it's not the same vein where we came from in the old time. So after the first temple was destroyed, there was great confusion among the Jewish people. First you have to understand that there was a tremendous disappointment. Every Jew, not every Jew of course, the very pious Jews, they understood that this was what God decided, and let it be for the best. For the first time they lost their pride. The Jews now were exposed to the rest of the world. And they were victimized, of course, victimized to the maximum. But many Jews were very disappointed. They never thought that the temple of God would be destroyed, so therefore they lost even the potential to pray. Until then, when all they had to do was to look upon the temple of God, to have the proper inspiration to pray to God. When the temple was no more, for the Jews it was so traumatic. The trauma was so great that there was a great fear among the sages that maybe Jews will stop worshipping God. There is such a thing in the Talmud. In the Talmud we find a statement that goes like this. When the temple was destroyed, the Talmud says in Masechet Berachot, Sha'arei Tfilah nin'alu. The gates of prayers were closed. Sha'arei dim'a lo nin'alu. The gates of tears did not close. This is a philosophical statement by the sages that has to be interpreted this way. After the destruction of the temple, Jews became very confused. To pray to whom? Are we sure now that there is a God? How did He allow to destroy His own house, where so many miracles happened there? Our sages say in Pirkei Avot that 10 miracles happened in the Bet HaMikdash, in the first temple every day. I'll give you just an example of what kind of miracles that they saw, that everybody saw. Millions of Jews saw that every day. For example, you know that one of the most common things in the temple of God, in Bet HaMikdash, was the sacrifices. You know, we're talking here about thousands of sacrifices of animals that were slaughtered in Bet HaMikdash. When you talk about animal sacrifice, we talk about meat also that was eaten by the Kohanim. There were many kinds of sacrifices. The first sacrifice was known as Korban Olah, the Olah offering. That was the only kind of animal, the only type of sacrifice that was to be burned entirely. No one was to benefit from it. Only it was strictly to God. And then came another kind of offering, the offering for sins, a sin offering. And then there was a guilt offering, a Korban Asham, Korban Khatat. There was also Korban Shlamim, peace offering. People felt like bringing a donation to Bet HaMikdash, they brought a sacrifice. And other kinds of offerings. We don't have the time now to elaborate on that. But for example, think about 3 times a year. The Torah says, Shalosh pe'amim b'shana yera'eh kol zechurecha et penei Hashem. 3 times a year the Jewish people was under the obligation to come to Jerusalem. From all the cities of Israel they had to come. They traveled by foot, on camel, on donkeys. And they all, even from outside Israel, from Babylon, they even came. For hundreds of years, they came 3 times a year. On Chag HaMatzot, Pesach, on Chag HaShavuot, and Chag HaSukkot. And whenever they came, whoever came, because the Torah says that there was an obligation to come to see the temple of God, which means to see God. That's how the Torah calls it. And the Torah says, Velo yera'u fanai rekam. The Torah requires that one should not come to see the face of God represented portrayed by the temple, which was a place of miracles. So everybody looked upon it as a tremendous spiritual inspiration. So when they brought, they were under the obligation to bring 2 sacrifices. Each family. The first sacrifice was known as Olat Re'iyah. All this that I am saying now is written in the first page of Masechet Hagigah. When they came, they brought the offering that was for seeing Hashem, that was to be burnt. But there was a second animal that was slaughtered for the purpose to partake, that all the families would sit down and rejoice and eat. So imagine hundreds of thousands of Jews who came to Jerusalem 3 times a year. And they brought their korbanot. You imagine how many animals were there? How many were you heard? We're talking here about tons of meat in Beit HaMikdash. What happens when you have so much meat in the same place and no refrigeration? How much can you preserve that meat? Obviously, the first thing that you suspect is that there might be some kind of, the meat might become rotten. I mean, who can consume so much? Of course, there were many things required in the Avodat Beit HaMikdash, such as the burning and the cleaning and everything. But what about the flies? It was in the open, in the periphery of Beit HaMikdash. And what about the flies? And in Jerusalem, in the summer, especially, and when you have meat, try to go to the east side of Jerusalem, that's the Arab side. And they have all kinds of meat in those butcher shops of theirs. They have meat that's hanging. You will see tons of flies on them. There was no such a thing that even one fly in Beit HaMikdash, not even one fly was seen on those mountains of meat. That was one of the 10 miracles that Pirkei Avot says. So you realize that all this happened, and there are other miracles that we don't have the time now to elaborate on them until we come to that stage when we will be learning it. But that happened only in the first temple. The second temple was not as miraculous as the first one. So you realize when the temple of God was destroyed, the first temple was destroyed, what a disappointment, what a setback was for the Jewish people. The trauma was so big that there was serious fear that there is no more Judaism. And even if there was still some kind of Judaism, they were afraid that maybe it will not last. How much longer can it last? In the land of Israel, only few remained. The rest now is spread in Babylonia. And obviously everybody was afraid that maybe there is no more Judaism. But thank God for the sages of Israel. A movement was organized, and we have discussed this last time. And there was a great man that God gave the Jewish people at that time to rescue the Jewish people from such a terrible danger of disappearance. He gave us a man by the name Ezra HaSofer. His book is written in one of the books of the Bible. You open the Bible towards the end, you will see that there is a small book known as Ezra. And our sages said that Ezra was almost like Moshe Rabbeinu. He had the same knowledge. In fact, our sages said if Ezra was in the time of Moses, he would be chosen to be the Moses of the Jewish people. And with special permission from the king of Persia, and all this, of course, after the Babylonian regime ended. Then when the Persian Empire took over the world after the Babylonian, the Jewish people were spread all the way in Babylonia, which included also Persia and Iran of today. The bulk of the Jewish people was in those areas. After the story of Esther and Mordechai of Esther and the great miracle, when did this happen? This happened after the destruction of the first temple. Now the Jews, as I said before, were longing for going back to the land of Israel. But they did not long for the land of Israel because they were in terrible situation in Babylon or Persia. The Jews of Babylon and Persia were very rich, and yet this is to be said for their praise, that they still wanted to go back to the land of Israel and to rebuild again the land of Israel. Special permission was given by the son of Esther, who was born to Esther and her father Achashverosh, the king of Persia. And special permission was given to the Jews to go back to the land of Israel and to rebuild the second temple. That was exactly 70 years after the destruction of the first temple. At that time, as I said, the Jewish people was confused how to pray. Many of them didn't know anymore the knowledge of the Torah. Many Jews lost their knowledge, and they didn't know how to pray. Now we needed a new kind of life, a new kind of guidance. And under the leadership of Ezra, the scribe, a great movement was organized. 120, it is, in fact, it's a group of made of prophets and great sages, and they were all organized and established by Ezra HaSofer after he left Persia, and they were with Nehemiah, and they came to the land of Israel, and they were in Yerushalayim, and they decided to rebuild again Bet HaMikdash, and the rebuilding started, and the Jewish people was there counting 50,000 that came from Babylon and Persia, 50,000 under the leadership of Ezra Sofer and Zerubbabel and Nehemiah. All this story is brought in the book of Nehemiah, which is the second book of Ezra, the book of Nehemiah in chapter Chet. And now we have a group of great men, prophets, very smart people, very knowledgeable people, counting in 120. That was known as the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the great assembly. They included among them even famous prophets, such as the last prophets of the Bible, such as Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. They included among them the very great visionary Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, that the Bible tells us about a very special miracle that happened to them, that they were rescued from the fire after they were thrown into the fire in the eyes of millions of people. And other great people were included, such as Mordechai and Esther, as we have mentioned, and all this is brought in the introduction of Maimonides and his book Mishneh Torah, as well as in his introduction to his commentary of the Mishnayot. So now we call this great group came to rescue Israel from their confusion. They decided to re-establish the religion, only now based on books. They sat down to write the prayer that we know today. That was the prayer that was written by these 120 rabbis that made up the prayer for us, of the morning, of the afternoon, of the night. And that's how now we know how to pray. Because before this great group, in the time of David and in the time of Solomon and all the kings of Israel, Jews, each one prays to himself. Everybody prayed to God, his own ways and his own words, his own understanding. But after that, you could not rely on that. Jews were not anymore on the same level, and therefore they needed guidance and a book that tells them what to pray. Many other things were established by the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the great assembly. Many mitzvot were given, as everybody knows. One point to be clarified: why is it that we call them the great assembly? In Hebrew, Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. Why do we call them the great assembly? The Talmud tells us in Masechet Yoma on page 69, Lama nikreu Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. What's the reason behind this title that we gave them? The men of the great assembly. We call them great because the Talmud says, "Sheyahziru atara leyoshna." They brought back the crown that was lost to its pedestal again. How do we understand this? The Talmud goes on to say the following. When Moshe, in the very beginning, when Moses brought us the Torah, he wrote there this, when he referred to the attributes of God, so he refers to him by Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vehanora. Everybody knows this sentence in your prayer 3 times a day. Ha'el, Baruch Ata Hashem, Elokeinu Eloheinu Avraham, Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vehanora. Which means, Ha'el means the God, Hagadol means the great, Hagibor means the powerful, Vehanora means the awesome, the fearful. This was a crown of Israel, that our God is so great and so powerful and so forth. After what I told you, you understand that when the temple was destroyed, not every Jew looked upon God as being the great and omnipotent God. They were disappointed. In fact, the Talmud portrays that in the following way. While Moshe gave us the word Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, Ve'hanora, in the time of Jeremiah the prophet, who 40 years before the destruction of the first temple already was rebuking the Jewish people for their iniquities and telling them that God is going to destroy Jerusalem and his temple if you don't do teshuvah. But the Jews were so sure of themselves then. It's impossible that the temple would be destroyed. So they did not listen to him enough when it was destroyed. So Jeremiah portrayed his bitterness by saying the following. Nochrim mekarkerim behechalo ayen or otav. How can we call him? How can we call God anymore Hanora, the fearful? I mean, strangers came from other lands and they went into his temple, and they had parties and orgies in the temple of God, and we call God the fearful when they did not fear him? What kind of fearful of God is this? That does not mean that Jeremiah did not believe in God. I said before, he portrayed the bitterness of the Jewish that took over the Jewish people after the destruction of the temple, and he portrayed it as if he is the one who's saying it. So how can you say Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor Ve'hanora? It's enough to say Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor. So he removed the word Nora, the fearful, the awesome. He removed it. But that was not enough. Because after him came Daniel, the famous Daniel, who was thrown into the pit of the lions, and he was, with a small prayer of his that he prayed, he said, Elahi shelach mal'acheh. Remember the story of Daniel? Didn't I tell you? In the book of Daniel, it's one of the books of the Bible. And there we read about the story of Daniel when he was taken to Babylon. Because of his tremendous wisdom, the king Nebuchadnezzar gave him a very high position in his royal. In fact, his position was so high that it provoked the jealousy of the non-Jewish ministers that were there. And they started to find any excuse to bring down Daniel. So one day they went to Nebuchadnezzar and they said to him, Majesty, you know that your friend Daniel does not worship you. Because Nebuchadnezzar wanted to be worshipped as a god. But Daniel would not worship him. In fact, he's the one who prayed towards the direction of Jerusalem from his window in Babylon. And his enemies heard this, and they immediately came and informed the king Nebuchadnezzar on this, and this was something that was immediately punished with death. But Nebuchadnezzar didn't care really. He knew that Daniel is very important to him, and he loved him. But what can he say? The law is the law. So he said to his enemies, all right, if that's what you say, if what you say is true, let's throw him in the pit of the lions. If the lions will kill him, that will prove you to be right, to be correct. If not, then let his God rescue him. They took Daniel and they threw him in the pit of the lions. Lions who did not eat for the last 3 days. You know what a lion, when he doesn't eat 3 days, what he does to you? If he sees you, Rahmin, They threw Daniel in the pit. And the animals were immediately going to ravage him. But Daniel said 2 words in Aramaic, in the old Aramaic, as we read in the book of Daniel. Elahi shelach malache ushlach ustam pur pum aryevata. It's a quotation in Aramaic which says, my God, send your angels and close the mouth of these lions. And you know what happened? Those lions, as starving as they were, they stood around Daniel, not touching him. They didn't get close to him. For 3 days he stayed there, just praying to God. And his enemies looking and taken by terror. And when the king came and he saw that, well, my friend Daniel has proven his case. Let him out and now throw the others, his enemies, into the pit of the lions. Don't worry, as they did not touch Daniel, they will not touch them also. They threw the people, the other ministers in the pit of the lions, and they did not last 1 minute. In a minute they became bones. That's the story of Daniel. So Daniel himself is one of our patriarchs. And he also portrayed the bitterness of his people Israel by removing another title to God. Remember, we said that before, we usually say Ha'el, Ha'gadol, Ha'gibor, Ve'Hanora. Yirmiyah the prophet came and removed Nora, which means the awesome, because he says, where is his, since his enemies do not fear him, why should we say the fearful? So he removed Nora. Came Daniel and he says, Ayeg Vurotav, where is his strength, where is his power? If his enemies came and they did his temple the way they did, then God forbid, it's like he is not powerful. So he removed the word Hagibor. All that was left is Ha'el HaGadol, the great God. That's all. That was a terrible, this is of course, it's only a play of words, but it does portray the real situation of the Jewish people in this time. That was a time in which of great confusion. So Daniel removed now we don't have any more Hagibor ve'Hanora, we have only Ha'el HaGadol. And then came the age of Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the great assembly, the 120 rabbis under the leadership of Ezra HaSofer. And they said, what? We should remove from our prayers Hagibor ve'Hanora, the powerful and the fearful? No, Chas v'Shalom. Here is what the Gemara says. Adraba, elu gevorotav. On the contrary, now we realize how God is powerful and how God is fearful. In other words, how people fear Him. What? Did they fear Him when they destroyed the temple and they made orgies and feasts, non-kosher feasts in His temple? So אלו גבורותיו ואלו מוראותיו שאלמלא מוראו של הקדוש ברוך הוא איך יכולה אומה אחת להתקיים בין האומות? The man of the great assembly says, on the contrary, all you have to do is open your mind and your eyes and see how the greatness of God, the God of Israel, how great He is and how awesome He is. Because if it was not for the fear that He inculcates into the heart of the nations, how come a nation, a downtrodden nation like ours, surrounded by 70 nations like wolves who hate us, and yet we survive? You tell me God is not powerful? God is not awesome? That's His awesomeness, that's His greatness. The fact that what He decided to destroy the temple, that's one thing. But at the same time, the nation didn't come and swallow us completely. We were not destroyed to total extinction, chas v'shalom. We are still here, kicking around. And that's the greatness of God. And that's what they established. So what did they do? They re-established again the words, the original words of Moshe, when they said, Ha'el, Ha'gadol, Ha'gibor, Ve'anora. And that's what we have today. When you pray Shachrit, Mincha, Arvit, that's what you say during the silent prayer in the beginning. Baruch Ata Hashem, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, Ha'el, Ha'gadol, Ha'gibor, Ve'hanora. This was re-established by the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the Great Assembly, and that's why we call them great. Verstehst? Now, as I told you, they counted 120 rabbis and prophets, as we find in the Gemara in Masechet Megillah on page 17. How long was the duration of the leadership of the men of the Great Assembly? For how many years? We understand that they lasted, the men of the Great Assembly, their leadership with their descendants, those that they appointed later on, it was altogether maybe an era of 200 years. All that time, now Babylon is over already. The kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar has perished because the Persian Empire came and swallowed the Babylonian Empire. And for 200 years, the Persian Empire ruled over the world. That was the time when the Great Assembly, when the rabbis of the Great Assembly took the leadership of the Jewish people and re-established again the faith in the heart of every Jew. Now Judaism was still alive and well, only without the temple. How long was the Persian Empire, which included the time of Mordechai and Esther? Now Jews, with the permission of Koresh, Cyrus, went back to the land of Israel to rebuild the second temple. Fine. Now we go to the era of the second temple. The second temple was not anymore as impressive as the first temple, but something. Now Israel is alive again, and the land of Israel now is not anymore like it was in the time of King David, when it was a Jewish kingdom. Now it was a Jewish autonomy under the rule first by the Persian Empire. Later, the Persian Empire was conquered by Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, who was the king of Macedonia and the Greek Empire, that was the next empire that ruled the world. Alexander the Great ruled practically most of the world. And he was, of course, the king of Israel also. Only he gave full autonomy to the Jews and did not oppress the Jews. The Jews in his time were free to do everything that they wanted as Jews. He never interfered with anything. What was the story of Alexander the Great? We find in the Talmud, it's brought in Masechet Yoma on page 69, Samechtet. Who was the last one? That what I'm going to tell you now was going to be the beginning of the lecture today. But since we missed last week, so I had to give you another picture which is like a review of the previous lecture. And then from now on we go from one stage to another. That is if you stay with me, of course. The Talmud tells us the following story. Now the world is under the domination of Alexander the Great, a young king, and yet tremendous. God gave him power, and he practically conquered the whole world. That was the Greek Empire. First there was the Babylonian Empire, then there was the Persian Empire, and those empires with all their riches and their power, they never thought that they will come to an end, to their end after a few years. America should heed this, by the way, because you never know. Let's hope that America will live long. But the kingdom of Persia, who thought in the time of Ahasuerus that the kingdom of Persia will end? Same thing also with Babylonia. Nebuchadnezzar thought that he is so powerful that he practically obligated the people to worship him as a god, thinking that his empire will never come to it will never perish. And yet now, where can you find the kingdom of Babylon, of Nebuchadnezzar? Only if you dig very deep in the sand of Iraq, then maybe you'll find something. All this is gone, finished. The Jewish people who has been downtrodden so much is still around here, very much alive. So now we are in the time of the Greek Empire. The Greek Empire led by Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great is supposed to go and conquer wherever he goes. There's no nation that stands before him. The same thing was coming towards the land of Israel. And they told him, Jews are in the land of in the city of Jerusalem, where they have their temple and they worship God in their temple. So he wanted to go. He came with all his army, hundreds of thousands of soldiers. And the Jews were at least very smart then. Why? Because they had a wonderful leader. The remnant of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. The last remnant of the men of the great assembly was Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon the righteous. There is a reason why we call him the righteous, the Talmud tells us, but that's not the point I like to bring now. Shimon HaTzadik was a Kohen Gadol, was the high priest of the Jewish people. And he was the leader. And he advised the Jews not to fight. How can you fight against a man who practically is the king of the world? So he decided to do the following. Let's have a nice delegation of all the priests and the sages. They will all wear white and gold. We'll take with us baskets of flowers and fruits. And rather than letting the king Alexander to penetrate into our city with battles, we will go out of our city to practically welcome him. And that's what they did. When Alexander came with all his army to the proximity of Jerusalem, a phenomenon happened. The gates of the city of Jerusalem opened, and a delegation of sages, a picture that was angelic, it's like if it came from heaven, from paradise. A delegation of very, very beautiful rabbis, white beard and white cloaks and gold, and the high priest going on the head and coming towards Alexander the Great. The generals of his army, they were cruel people. They didn't care. But suddenly they were amazed at what they saw next. They saw their king, Alexander, coming down off his horse, going towards Shimon HaTzadik, the great Shimon, the high priest, and prostrating, bowing before him. The generals of the army of Alexander could not understand this. Majesty, what's going on? You bow to a Jew? He said, yes, I bow to this man because that's the man I saw in my dream yesterday night. Last night I had a dream, and that's the man I saw in my dream. That's a man of God, and I shall definitely honor him. So the Talmud tells us that the Jewish people welcomed Alexander inside the city, and Alexander also honored the Jewish population by not touching them in any way to harm them, and he offered sacrifices in the temple of God with the special permission of the Jewish leaders. And because as an act of recognition and consideration, every baby that was born that year in Jerusalem was named Alexander. And that was the time of Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik, if you remember the last teaching of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. You allow me another 10 minutes? I know we're late. Allow me to review again the last teaching of the men of the Great Assembly as brought in the first paragraph of Pirkei Avot. And then from next weekend on, we will go from one paragraph to another to explore the wisdom of our sages and their moralities. And you will have plenty to learn. Of course, we will try to elaborate on each and every philosophy that we will be learning. But the first teaching that we have in Pirkei Avot was 3 statements that were made by the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, who taught us many, many things. But those 3 things that the Pirkei Avot begins its book with, that is teaching us the philosophy of Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the Great Assembly, that will guarantee the survival of the Jewish people as a Torah nation. So first they said, we did say this in the last lecture, Hevu metunim badin, let us be patient and minutious and precise when it comes to the study of Jewish law. Which means they wanted to clarify the point that Jewish law must be mastered to the maximum if we want the Jewish people to have a Torah future. You have to have a law that is clear. And that's the meaning of the first teaching of the Great Assembly. The second teaching was Ve'amidu talmidim harbe. We want many students to come to the yeshiva. What was wrong? Well, I can tell you, for example, that before this and after, there were many times in the Jewish history when not every student was accepted in the yeshiva. For example, I'll cite a few sources from this. In Masechet Berachot on page 28, we find that Rabban Gamliel used to say, "Kol talmid she'en tocho kevaro al yikanes levet hamidrash." Any student who is not pure-hearted and his inside is not like outside, or his outside is not like the inside, which means sincere, has no permission to come into Bet HaMidrash, into the house of study. They wanted people to study Torah, but only the people who are fit for the Torah. There was a time in Jewish history when they didn't see everybody fit to learn Torah. So Rabban Gamliel was one of those. Bet Shammai were also one of those. Bet Shammai used to say, Al yishne adam ela lemi she'anav v'chacham uben avot. This is how you choose students to come to study in the yeshiva. First you have to see if he is humble. That's condition number 1. Number 2, if he is wise, not an idiot. And number 3, he has to come from a noble family. A simple family, who knows, you cannot trust the Torah in his hands. That was even the opinion of Bet Shammai. Until Bet Hillel came, with the appearance of Hillel, the great rabbi. When he came, then he decided, when we will come to the history of Hillel in the next few weeks, we shall talk more about Hillel. By the way, I had in mind to speak last week. If I was not caught by this allergical cough, I would have told you the stories of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, because this was the week of the Hilulah of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the Talmid of Rabbi Akiva. But we will come back to those things if God wills it. So, till Hillel came, and then he says, Lechol Adam Yishnu, which means you have to teach Torah to everyone, without making any distinction. Why? What was the problem then? The Talmud tells us, our sages say in the book of Avot de Rabbi Natan, in chapter 2, it says that after the destruction of the temple, criminality started to be rampant among the Jewish people. There were many criminals, thieves, robbers, so forth. So they could not allow everybody to come to study Torah. They wanted people who are still pure. But when Hillel came, said, no, let everybody come, because the Torah will fix them. Even those ones who were not good, if with the criminal mind, the Torah will make them more better people, and that's how we solve the problem. And that's exactly what happened, Of course, there are always exceptions, but that's the beginning of the time when the opened full opening to everyone who wanted to come to study Torah. Today, unfortunately, you have to beg people to come to study Torah, right? In those times, people begged to come to study Torah and they were refused. Remember the story of Hillel? I think I will allow myself to tell you a small story as we find in Masechet Shabbat, the story of Hillel and Masechet Yoma, of course. What happened to Hillel? Hillel was very poor. The man, Hillel became, at the end he was the Nasi. He was the president of the Sanhedrin, the greatest rabbi in his time, approximately 250 years or 200 years before the destruction of the second temple. So Hillel, he adored to study Torah. But then to study Torah was very expensive. He had to pay a lot of money to enter the house of study. It was in the generation of Shemaiah and Avtalion, those two great rabbis who were the leaders of the generation, and yet they were children of non-Jews, they converted. So in their time, not everybody was allowed, except if you pay a lot of money. And Hillel was very poor. In fact, he had to work very hard. And he used to give half his salary, he used to cut wood in the forest. And he would give half his money to the guy who stands at the entrance of the yeshiva, so that he can learn. One time it was winter, he could not work enough to have enough money for that half. He had only half for his own sustenance, for his family. So what did he do? You think he didn't go to yeshiva? He couldn't go through the entrance because he didn't have the money to pay. So he went on the roof. He didn't care about the cold. He was cold, the winter and everything. And he went to listen to the lecture of Shmaya and Avtalion. And he was so absorbed by the Torah lecture that he was listening to, that he did not pay attention that snow started to fall and covering him. He was covered by the snow totally. And of course he lost conscience. And it was Shabbat. In the morning, Shabbat morning, when the people came to the synagogue, and Shmaya and Avtalion, the great rabbis, came to open the shul, they saw that with that window from which the light of the sun penetrated was obstructed by the snow. And they thought, he said, I think I see the shape of a human being there. And they went up, and they saw that there is a man who, of course, almost dead, under the snow. They gave special order to start a fire on Shabbat. They desecrated the Shabbat for the purpose to save the life of Hillel. That day, when they finally saved him and they brought him back to life, they decided to open the Bet HaMidrash without having to pay anything for and the same day 400 benches were added to the house of study. And then later on we know the story that Hillel became the greatest rabbi, and he was chosen, even the leadership then, which was Bnei Betera, they gave their seat to Hillel when he came to Jerusalem, and he became the chief rabbi then. So you see, that's the reason why they said the Great Assembly, the men of the Great Assembly said in the second statement, Ve'amidu talmidim arbe. If you want the future of the Jewish people, make no mistake about it. The Jewish people cannot survive without Torah. Take away the Torah, the Jewish people will not last more than one generation. What permitted the Jewish people to last until today was only because of the Torah study. So that our sages of old, they understood that. They knew without the Torah there is no future of the Jewish people. So therefore they said there is only one way to assure and guarantee the continuity of the Jewish people, through the transition, the proper transition of the Torah. So that's why we need many, many students. Many students. In fact, there is a midrash in Kohelet Rabbah that says, בנוהג שבעולם, 1,000 בני אדם נכנסים למקרא, יוצאים מהם 100. If 1,000 Jews study the Chumash, the Torah, the Bible, only 100 of them will come out okay. If 1,000 will go to study Mishnah, Yotzim mehem asara. Only 10 of them will come out successful. La Talmud. But if 1,000 Jews will go to study Talmud, then only one can come out really great. So that's why the men of the Great Assembly understood that in order to have great leadership, even one great rabbi, let's say one Vilna Gaon, or even of today, one Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, to have one like him, you have to have thousands of students, that from which one will come out to be a great one. So that's the reason why you have to have many, many students of Torah. You cannot rely only on the perfect child to assure the continuity of the Torah. You have to have the masses coming, and then some of them will come out to be, and they will be the leaders of the generations in Torah. And finally, the third statement of the Great Assembly was, Va'asu sayag la Torah. We have discussed this last time. And erect a fence around the Torah. Which means the Torah cannot remain just as it is. You have to, in order to preserve it, you have to erect a whole fence around it. And that's how we got the Talmud, the oral law, to give us all the laws that came in order to preserve the purity of the Torah inside. We shall discuss this even further. I will jump again for 2 minutes to Shimon HaTzadik, because that's where we are going to take off from him and the others. So Shimon HaTzadik came. He is the remnant. That means 200 years after Ezra HaSofer, after the beginning of the men of the Great Assembly. The last one was Shimon HaTzadik. And Shimon HaTzadik gave us many, many things. He taught us many things, and throughout the Talmud we find many teachings of Shimon HaTzadik. But the most famous are those that were written in the Pirkei Avot. He says, Al shelosha devarim ha'olam omed, al Torah ve'al avodah ve'al gemilut chasadim. He says, the world stands on 3 things. On the Torah, on avodah, which I will explain, and on gemilut chasadim, loving kindness and charity. So now we see that the statement of Shimon HaTzadik comes to teach us that without Torah, the first foundation that gives existence to the world is the Torah. Many people don't believe in that. But you should know, you should believe that without our Torah, you have no President Bush. You don't have any goy, nothing will last. The world owes its existence, or rather its continuous existence, to those few pockets of people who study Torah every day. Without them, there is no Torah. The world cannot exist. Like it says in the book, Im lo beriti yomam v'layla chukot shamayim va'aretz lo samti. If it is not for my laws that I have given you, God says, I would not bother to create the laws of the universe, which means the sun, the moon, and all this. The world. So that's what Shimon HaTzadik says. The world will continue only if we know that the first foundation is Torah. And that's what kept us alive. I'm asking you, just think very realistically. Check into the history of the Jewish people. What was that kept us alive? If it's not the Torah, then you don't know what's going on. Every generation owes its existence only on those who kept the Torah and learned it. And the second thing was, in the time of Shimon HaTzadik, and for at least 1,000 years, avodah korbanot. As I said before in the early stage of the lecture, Jews came to Jerusalem to bring offerings in Beit HaMikdash. Animals, sacrifices. It is not a very popular thing to say today. And by the way, one of our prayers in the silent prayer is to bring back this. We ask Hashem to bring back again that great thing, that the sacrifices. Of course today, what are you talking about? You want me to take now an animal and take it to Beit HaMikdash? I can't. Today the world is built in a different way. That's what the Maimonides says. That's the reason why God stopped the bringing of the sacrifices, because it was not anymore adequate to the way the world is going. But we never know what it means in the future. But in the time of the Jewish people in Jerusalem, in the time of the temple, there was no greater ambience and rejoicing like the time when they brought sacrifices. So therefore, when Shimon HaTzadik says that the world is built on the bringing of the sacrifices, you know what he was saying. It's a historical statement that those sacrifices practically benefited the Goyim also. In Sukkot, we brought 70 sacrifices for the welfare of the Goyim, of the non-Jews. Imagine the non-Jews that came and destroyed the temple. They destroyed maybe 95% of the legitimacy of their own existence. But that's a different area to explore another day. And finally, Shimon HaTzadik says the third statement is, the third foundation, Gemilut Chasadim, kindness. I mean, even if you have Torah. By the way, today, Avodah, the bringing of the sacrifices, has been replaced 2,000 years ago by the prayer. Like it says in the Pasuk, Unshalema parim sefatenu. We shall compensate for the sacrifices by the service of our lips. So every morning when we go to the prayer, we recite all the, I don't know, Rahmin, if you know, do we go early enough to synagogue to see that in the beginning we recite for at least 15 minutes all the story of the bringing of the offerings in the temple. For two reasons. At least to keep our hope that the future will be again like it used to be. Something not very pleasant for some ears. But the truth is that let God decide what to be in the future. We shall see. When the Mashiach comes, let's see. We will see. But in the meantime, we can keep the same hopes. Why not? So the point is like this. That Shimon HaTzadik says, the first foundation is Torah. Second foundation is the worship. Before it was the sacrifices. And now it is the prayers. You have to keep in touch with God. You have to talk to Him every day. The sages say that when you study Torah, God speaks to you. But when you pray, you speak to God. See the difference? So we need to speak to Him. Through the prayer, a lot of our Jewish obligations are learned. It's so important to go to synagogue every day. People who go to synagogue every day, even if they don't learn Torah, they will know plenty of the Jewish law. They will know what to do. They will know that in Sukkot you have to do the lulav and etrog and all the 4 species. If you don't go to synagogue, how else will you know? So therefore it is essential for Judaism. And finally, Gemilut Chasadim. Tzedakah, charity and loving kindness. Without charity and loving kindness between Jew and his fellow man, the world cannot exist. Even if you have Torah, if you don't deal with charity and loving kindness, if you don't help the others, you are going to miss so much that you will not be able to preserve the survival and the hope of the continuation of the Jewish people. And that's what Shimon HaTzadik came to teach us. From now on, we shall go from one paragraph to another, Im Yirtzeh Hashem, and if you are still with us. So God bless you for having patience to stay until 10:20. But we came late, so therefore it's okay.